Welcome to Human Monsters. I'm going to open with some bullet points regarding the history of residential schools in Canada. 1834, the Mohawk Institute in Brantford, Ontario, begins taking on boarders. It is the oldest residential school included in the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement, IRSSA. 1851, Mount Elgin School opens in Muncie, Ontario. 1860, Beaufort School, also known as Iliala Cross, opens in what is now Saskatchewan. 1863, St. Mary's School opens in Mission, British Columbia. 1863, St. Albert School opens in what is now Alberta. 1867, Constitution Act. 1867 assigns the federal government jurisdiction over, quote, Indians and lands reserved for the Indians, close quote. 1867, Sacred Heart School opens in Fort Providence in what is now the Northwest Territories. 1868, Wikwemikong School opens on Manitoulin Island, Ontario. 1876, the Indian Act consolidates earlier legislation that defined and limited First Nations life in Canada. The Act becomes the basis for regulation of the residential school system. 1879, the Davin Report recommends the establishment of government-funded, church-run residential schools on the prairies. 1883, Parliament authorizes the creation of 3 industrial schools in the Northwest Territories. 1883, Battleford Industrial School opens in what is now Saskatchewan. 1888, Birtle Residential School, the first in Manitoba, opens. 1891, Jean Leroux, a translator for Indian Affairs and recruiter for Catholic residential schools in Alberta, is allowed to resign rather than face a criminal investigation into allegations of sexual abuse. 1892, a federal government order in council cuts funding to industrial schools. 1894, an amendment to the Indian Act empowers Indian agents to send children to residential schools if they deem parents, quote, unfit or unwilling to provide for the child's education, close quote. Parents who do not return children who had run away from schools become subject to prosecution. 1899, Indian Affairs Minister Clifford Sifton issues instruction that allows Métis children to be enrolled in residential schools. 1903, the first residential school for Métis children opens at St. Paul de Métis in what is now Alberta. 1905, the boarding school at St. Paul de Métis is destroyed by a fire that kills 1 student. 1907, Indian Affairs Chief Medical Officer Dr. Peter Bryce reports that 24% of the students who had enrolled in 15 Western Canadian schools since 1886 were dead. 1910, Indian Affairs and church organizations negotiate a contract that increases funding and imposes standards for the schools. 1914, a father successfully sues the Mohawk Institute principal for locking his daughter in a cell for 3 days on what is described as a water diet. 1920, The Indian Act is amended to make attendance at a day school or residential school compulsory for First Nations school-aged children. 1920, the St. Paul's Hostel for Métis students opens in Dawson City, Yukon. 1927, 19 students and one staff member die in a fire that destroys the Beauval School in Saskatchewan. 1930, the Indian Act is amended to increase the discharge age from 15 to 16. 1930, 13 students and one teacher die in a fire that destroys the Cross Lake, Manitoba school. 1930, Shubenacadie School opens in Nova Scotia. 1931, St. Joseph's School opens in Fort George, Quebec. 1933, the Indian Act is amended to appoint all Royal Canadian Mounted Police officers as truant officers. 1937, Indian Affairs issues a policy directive ending the enrollment of Métis children in residential schools. 1939, the Supreme Court of Canada rules that Inuit are, quote, Indians under Canadian law. 1939, BC police refused to return runaways to Cooper Island School after concluding the boys had likely been sexually abused at the school. The local Indian agent advises the suspected abusers to leave the province, allowing them to avoid prosecution. 1944, Indian Affairs Superintendent of Welfare and Training, R.A. Hoey, tells a parliamentary committee that he believes the residential schools should be gradually closed. 1947, Dr. L.B. Pett, Director of the Nutrition Division of the Department of National Health and Welfare, reports that, quote, no school was doing a good feeding job. 1948, Special Joint Committee on the Indian Act recommends that, quote, wherever and whenever possible, Indian children should be educated in association with other children. 1951, amendments to the Indian Act authorize Indian Affairs to enter into agreements with school boards and provincial governments to have First Nations students attend public schools. 1951, the federal government institutes a nationwide policy for discipline at residential schools. 1954, the federal government takes over the responsibility of staffing at all government-owned residential schools. 1955, the federal government approves an extensive program for the construction of schools and hostels in the Northwest Territories and northern Quebec. 1958, the first 3 large hostels in the Northwest Territories open: Akacho Hall in Yellowknife, Fleming Hall in Fort McPherson, and Brainat Hall in Fort Smith. 1958, Grolier Hall, Inuvik, opens. During the next 2 decades, there was never a year in which the school did not employ at least one dormitory supervisor who would later be convicted for sexually abusing students at the school. 1960, food allowances based on Canada's official food rules are included in the residential school funding formula. 1969, the federal government ends its partnership with churches and takes over direct administration of residential schools. 1969, the federal government transfers responsibility for residential schools in the Northwest Territories and the Yukon to the territorial governments. 1970, parents occupy the Blue Quills School in Alberta for 17 days until the government agrees to transfer control to an Aboriginal Education Authority. 1970, the Mohawk Institute closes. 67 schools remain in operation. 1980, 22 schools in operation. 1982, the Constitution Act 1982 recognizes and affirms the rights of, quote, Indian, Inuit, and Métis peoples of Canada. 1986, the United Church of Canada issues an apology for its role in the colonization of Aboriginal people. 1990, 13 schools in operation. 1990, Phil Fontaine, Grand Chief of the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, speaks publicly about the abuse he suffered at Fort Alexander Residential School. 1991, the Caribou Tribal Council organizes a national conference on residential schools. 1991, the missionary Oblates of Mary Immaculate apologized to Aboriginal people for their role in the residential school system. 1993, the Anglican Church of Canada apologizes to Aboriginal people for its role in the residential school system. 1994, the Assembly of First Nations publishes Breaking the Silence, an interpretive study of residential school impact and healing as illustrated by the stories of First Nations individuals. 1994, the RCMP launches the Native Indian Residential School Task Force to investigate complaints of historic physical and sexual abuse at residential schools in BC. 1995, the Presbyterian Church in Canada apologizes to Aboriginal people for its role in the residential school system. 1996, the Nuu-chah-nulth Tribal Council publishes Indian Residential Schools, the Nuu-chah-nulth Experience. 1996, the report of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples calls for a public inquiry into the effects of residential schools on generations of Aboriginal peoples. 1998, former Mohawk Institute students file a class action claim for damages. This claim is referred to as the Cloud Case. 1998, the Coupal School closes in Saskatchewan. 1998, the United Church of Canada apologizes to Aboriginal people for its role in the residential school system. 2000, all schools have closed. 2005, Assembly of First Nations National Chief Phil Fontaine announces a class action lawsuit against the Government of Canada over the legacy of the residential schools. 2005, the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement is negotiated as an out-of-court settlement of the student class action suits. 2007, the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement comes into effect. It provides benefits to former students of 140 schools. Certain classes of Aboriginal students and types of schools are, however, not included in the agreement. 2008, Prime Minister Stephen Harper apologizes to First Nations, Inuit, and Métis for the residential school system. 2008, the Indian Residential Schools Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, TRC, is established. 2015, the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation opens in Winnipeg, Manitoba. 2015, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau instructs the Minister of Indigenous and Northern Affairs to implement the TRC's calls to action. The Aboriginal peoples of Canada experienced cultural genocide as the country's colonial roots were indelibly embedded in the country's social landscape. The European University Institute defines cultural genocide in these terms. Cultural genocide is the systematic destruction of traditions, values, language, and other elements that make one group of people distinct from another. Cultural genocide remains a recurrent topic, appearing not only in the form of wide-ranging claims about the commission of cultural genocide in diverse contexts, but also in the legal sphere, as exemplified by the discussion before the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, and also the drafting of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. These discussions have, however, displayed the lack of a uniform understanding of the concept of cultural genocide, and thus of the role that international law is expected to fulfill in this regard. The concept of cultural genocide, international law perspective, details how international law has approached the core idea underlying the concept of cultural genocide and how this framework can be strengthened and fostered. It traces developments from the early conceptualization of cultural genocide to the contemporary question of its reparation. Through this journey, the book discusses the evolution of various branches of international law in relation to both cultural protection and cultural destruction in light of a number of legal cases in which either the concept of cultural genocide or the idea of cultural destruction has been discussed. Such cases include the destruction of cultural and religious heritage in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and the forced removals of Aboriginal children in Australia and Canada, and the case law of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights in relation to Indigenous and tribal groups' cultural destruction. The Indigenous peoples of Canada became a very disempowered demographic. At one time, they were ruled by self-government, but the federal government replaced those with tribal bands, who were not nearly as empowered to make decisions for their own people. Deputy Minister of Indian Affairs Duncan Scott said of the assimilation effort in 1920, "Our object is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic." Unlike in most other religions, women were influential and even held positions of authority and reverence in Aboriginal tribal councils. After the genocide, they were stripped of their power. The so-called Indians, as the colonialists called them, were branded as savages, and there were efforts to strip them of their culture and spiritual practices. The government frequently jailed Native Canadian spiritual leaders and confiscated objects used in Indigenous spiritual rites. This policy was enforced by the Catholic Church when it came to the residential schools. The government and the church took upon themselves to, quote, civilize Native children. This involved forcing them to speak English and suppress their native languages. They were made to convert to Catholicism. Sadly, this only scratches the surface of what the Aboriginal children went through during this very dark period in Canadian history. Aboriginal students who had yet to be taken from their families to live in and attend a residential school would learn their fate was sealed with a knock on the door, typically in the morning. For over a century, this was an introduction to the system for thousands of Aboriginal children. Their parents stood there helplessly as they watched their children taken by government officials under threat of prosecution if they resisted. It was a common outcome for many of those children that they never saw their parents again. One such child was named Frederick Ernest Coe, who lived in Aklavik, Northwest Territories. An Anglican minister and officer of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police informed him that he was leaving his family for a residential school. To quote Frederick, "And I didn't get to say goodbye to my dad or my brother Alan, didn't get to pet my dogs or nothing." Marlene Casey's lived in the Leastock, Saskatchewan residential school. Her parents drove her to the town of Wadena for their rendezvous with the government agents. Of this experience, she said, "There was a big truck there. It had a back door, and that truck was full of kids, and there was no windows on that truck." Larry Beardy was taken by train from Churchill, Manitoba, to an Anglican residential school in Dauphin, Manitoba. It was a 1,200-kilometer trip. When they realized they weren't going to see their parents again, the younger children began to weep. Every time the train stopped, more children were ushered inside, and they too would begin to cry. A woman named Florence Horace said of this, "That train I want to call that train of tears." Florence was taken to the school in Fort Providence, Northwest Territories, in a small airplane. The plane made a few stops along the way to pick up more children. To quote Florence, "When the plane took off, there was about 6 or 5 older ones. Didn't cry, but I saw tears come right out of their eyes. Everybody else was crying. There's a whole plane crying. I wanted to cry too, 'cause my brother was crying, but I held my tears back and held him." The arrivals were often just as painful as the departures and commutes. At Fort Chipewyan in northern Alberta, Vitaline Elsie Jenner battled the authorities to stay with her mother. She pleaded with her mother, saying, "Mama, Mama, kaya nakasing." And in English it was, "Mom, Mom, don't leave me." Because that's all I knew was to speak Cree. And so the nun took us. Nellie Ningawans was born and raised in Hudson, Ontario, but was assigned to the Sioux Lookout School for attendance in the 1950s and 60s. Of her introduction to the facility, she said, "When we arrived, we had to register that we had arrived. Then they took us to cut our hair." Speaking of which, Bernice Jacks became frightened when her hair was cut. She said, "I could see my hair falling, and I couldn't do nothing. And I was so afraid I wasn't thinking about myself. I was thinking about Mom. I say, Mom's going to be really mad, and June is going to be angry, and it's going to be my fault. Martha Basil-Koku recalled feeling a chill as she first encountered the school in Pointe-Bleue, Quebec. It was something like a gray day. It was a day without sunshine. It was the impression that I had that I was only 6 years old. Then, well, the nuns separated us, my brothers, and then my uncles. Then I no longer understood. Then that was a period there of suffering, nights of crying. We all gathered in a corner, meaning that we came together, and there we cried. Our nights were like that. Pauline St. Onge was traumatized just at the sight of this school, as she said of her first encounter when her father dragged her to its doors. I thought in my child's head, I said, you would make me go there, but I will learn nothing, nothing. Campbell Pepequash experienced firsthand what the residential schools had in mind for a welcome wagon. And after I was taken there, they took off my clothes and then they deloused me. I didn't know what was happening, but I learned about it later, that they were delousing me. The dirty, no good for nothing savages, lousy. Roy Denny was disturbed by the kind of attire the clergy at the Shubenacadie, Nova Scotia school wore. We were greeted by this man dressed in black with a long gown. That was the priest, come to find later, and the nuns with their black outfits with the white collar and a white collar and like a breastplate of white. For Calvin Mirion, part of the culture shock involved encountering the enormous dimensions of the school in Brandon, Manitoba, in comparison to the small house he had been living in with his family, as he recounted. The only building that I knew up to that time, that moment in my life, was the one-story house that we had. And when I got to the residential school, I seen this big monster of a building. And I've never seen any buildings that large, that high. Archie Hyacinth described the trauma he felt as he was essentially kidnapped by the state and taken to the school. That's when the trauma started for me, being separated from my sister, from my parents, and from our home. We were no longer free. It was like being, taken to a strange land, even though it was our land, as I understood later on. Margot Wild's feeling of incarceration in the Amos, Quebec school was just as keenly felt. She also felt like an interloper because she didn't speak French. As she put it, I said to myself, how am I going to express myself? How will I make people understand what I'm saying? And I wanted to find my sisters to ask them to come and get me. It's sad to say, but I felt I was a captive. The indigenous people developed their own clothing, which is just as traditional as other aspects of their culture. When the children arrived at the residential school, they were required to hand over the clothes they arrived in and wear school uniforms. Their traditional clothing was burned. Martin Nicholas said of this, My mom had prepared me in native clothing. She had made me a buckskin jacket, beaded with fringes, and my mom did beautiful work, and I was really proud of my clothes. And when I got to residential school, that first day, I remember they stripped us of our clothes. Lorna Morgan arrived at the school wearing a pair of moccasins her grandmother made for her. The school staff threw them in the garbage. The experience of attending one of the residential schools was dehumanizing in all sorts of ways. One way was that they assigned each student a number, erasing their identity by negating all use of their birth names. Gilles Pediquet attended the Point Bleu school, and he recalled the day he was issued a number. I remember that the first number that I had at the residential school was 95. I had that number, 95, for a year. The second number was number 4. I had it for a longer period of time. The third number was 56. I also kept it for a long time. We walked with the numbers on us. Eventually, the children were given English or French names. Older siblings were separated from their younger siblings. Wilbur Abrahams tried following his sister to the girls' side of the school. A staff member caught up with him and pulled him backward by the ear, telling him to go back the other way. Wilbur said of this, "I have always believed that. I think at that particular moment, my spirit left." The schools segregated the boys from the girls, and there was only intermingling of the sexes on occasions like Christmas and other religious holidays. As Daniel Nanuch recalled, they had a fence in the playground. Nobody was allowed near the fence. The boys played on this side, the girls played on the other side. Nobody was allowed to go to that fence there and talk to the girls through the fence or whatever. You can't. Any child who snuck over to engage with a sibling was harshly disciplined, typically with physical abuse. William Herney remembered the first frightening days of his experience at the Shubenacadie School in Nova Scotia. Within those few days, you had to learn because otherwise you're going to get your head knocked off. Anyway, you learned everything. You learned to obey. And one of the rules that you didn't break, you obey. And you were scared. You were very scared. Timothy Henderson was enrolled in schools in Manitoba. He said of his experience, every day was, you were in constant fear that your hope was that it wasn't you today that was going to be the target, the victim. You know, you weren't going to have to suffer any form of humiliation. Shirley Waskowicz attended kindergarten in the Catholic residential school in Onion Lake, Saskatchewan. She said of her time there, "I learned the fear, how to be so fearful at 6 years old. It was instilled in me." Patrick Breuer attended the school at Fort Alexander, Manitoba. The nights were just as hard as the days for him. As he recounted, there was, a few nights I remember that I just, cried myself to sleep. I guess because of, wanting to see my mom and dad. Ernest Barkman understood that very well. He was enrolled at the Pine Creek School. He said, "I was really lonely, and I cried a lot. My brother who was with me said I cried a lot." Paul Dixon was enrolled in schools in Ontario and Quebec. He said the children did their best to cry quietly at night. To quote Paul, if one child was caught crying, everybody was in trouble. As Betsy Anahutuk put it, when one person would start crying, all the little girls would start crying, all of us. We were different ages, and we would cry like little puppies or dogs right into the night until we go to sleep, longing for our families. Rick Gilbert remembered the heartless atmosphere of the school in Williams Lake, British Columbia, a place that was devoid of compassion and empathy. As he noted, that was one thing about this school, was that when you got hurt or got beat up or something and you started crying, nobody comforted you. You just sat in the corner and cried till you got tired of crying. Then you got up and carried on with life. Part of a child's survival strategy in the residential schools was to suppress their emotions. To quote Nick Sibbleston, who was put in the Fort Providence School in the Northwest Territories at the age of 5, in residential school, you quickly learn that you should not cry. If you cry, you're teased, you're shamed out, you're even punished. The staff were remembered as never smiling and never showing any warmth to the children. Their presence was strictly administrative. Victoria McIntosh lost her ability to trust during her time at a residential school. As she put it, you learn not to cry anymore, you just get harder. And you learn to shut down. The schools were ineptly heated and ventilated. They were poorly built, and the education provided was substandard compared to mainstream educational standards across the country. The food was of poor quality. Even prisons provided a higher standard of living than the residential schools. Shirley Flowers made this statement to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. The whole part of the residential school was a part of a bigger scheme of colonization. There was intent. The schools were there with the intent to change people, to make them like others, and to make them not fit. And today, we have to learn to decolonize. Speaking on the quality of education at the residential school, Regional Industrial School Principal R.B. Heron said that children are not kept regularly in the classroom, that they are kept out at work that produces revenue for the school, that when they return to the reserves, they have not enough education to enable them to transact ordinary business, scarcely enough to enable them to write a legible letter. The children often didn't perform well under the circumstances into which they were transplanted. Between being forced to learn a new language and the culture shock, it was barely within the realm of possibility. To quote R. Bowden, principal of the Wikwemicong, Ontario School, what we may reasonably expect from the generality of children is certainly not to make great scholars of them. Good and moral as they may be, they lack great mental capacity. Very harsh words for children who are set up to fail. Indeed, to further clarify his low expectations of them, he said, It wouldn't be realistic to expect them to be equal in every respect to their white brethren. A government inspector overseeing the Onion Lake School in Saskatchewan said, "In arithmetic, abstract ideas develop slowly in the Indian child." Another official commented that he felt educating Aboriginal children was a dangerous pursuit, perhaps feeling threatened by how it might empower them in the years to come as adults. He need not have worried, since most of the so-called instruction was really just dictation and rote memorization. There was no real intellectual stimulation going on. It was manual labor for the mind. To make matters worse, because the religious authorities who oversaw the schools emphasized religious instruction, many of the teachers they hired had no training or experience in the field of teaching. To quote one principal, "While it is very important that the Indian child should be educated, it is of more importance that he should build up a good, clean character to counteract the evil tendencies of the Indian nature." Louise Moyne recalled how heavily embedded the religious element was in her life at the residential school. From the time we got out of bed at the sound of the bell, we went down on our knees to pray. After we had washed and dressed, we headed for the chapel to attend Low Mass, which was always held at 7 a.m. The staff felt that the best future they could give to the Indigenous children was to dispatch them back to the reserves with Christian values. It did rub off on some students, with some pursuing careers with the church, like a few males who went on to become ministers. However, little to no encouragement was given to the native children who wished to pursue higher education. As Indian Affairs Deputy Minister Duncan Campbell Scott said to them, "It's no use sending you Indians to school. You just go back to the reserve anyway." Many found it difficult to learn in the residential school environment, which was often traumatic. As David Charleston put it, "I never wanted to learn, so I jumped into my shell. I took kindergarten twice because of what happened to me. I didn't want to learn." Isabel Whitford had a hard time adjusting due to her lack of experience with English and the draconian discipline. As she noted, "Every time I couldn't get an answer, she would pull my ears and shake my head." Betsy Olson found the classwork to be a hardship in and of itself. As she put it, spelling was always 30, 40, it was way down. And when we did spelling, sometimes I freeze. I couldn't move. I just scribbled because I couldn't move my hand. Leona Agawa was just as terrified. As she recalled, "I'd hear my name, but I never got to answer. I stood up, never got to answer what they were saying when they sat me down, and I'd get a good slap after you leave there for not being nice in school." Textbooks used in these schools included mentions of Aboriginal peoples, though hardly in a dignified light. They were often referred to by slurs such as squaws and redskins. To quote Mary Korshine, "Their only mandate was to Christianize and civilize, and it's written in black and white, and every single day we were reminded." Lorna Cochrane recalled a particularly disturbing illustration. There was a picture of two Jesuits lying in the snow. They were murdered by these two, quote, savages, and they had this, what we call, a blood-curdling look on their faces, is how I remember that picture. Such was an example of a social studies lesson in a residential school. Many of the students were eventually transferred to public schools due to the low quality of instruction they received in the residential schools. They were ill prepared for the public school environment. Walter Jones recalled the answer that a classmate received when he asked if he would be able to proceed to grade 12. That supervisor said, "You don't need to go that far. Your people are never going to get education to be a professional worker, and it doesn't matter what lawyer or doctor or electrician or anything that a person has to go to school for." Some residential school students have pointed out that their experiences were positive. It depended on the school, but many were taught leadership abilities, marketable skills, and were mentored by staff. Many of the students at these facilities had bright futures filled with opportunities because of the ways in which their teachers nurtured their potential. Some students did better than others. Madeline Dion Stout was an academic success, but she credits not the school, but her upbringing in the reserve. "It's not residential school that made me a good student. The fundamental values and good example I had before I went to residential school by my grandfather and my parents and all the old people on the reserve where I grew up are the ones who made me a good student." Because these schools were underfunded, they were expected by the government to be self-sufficient. Due to this, it was often difficult for the children to devote their time to their studies since they were assigned chores, like working the farm that fed them, perform domestic tasks, and altering their clothes. As a result, the daily schedule for the school operated according to a half-day system. Though the administrators would like to have the work the children did classified as vocational training, it was really just a sweatshop. They often worked both before and after school. They worked 2 hours a day in winter and 4 hours a day in summer. To quote one principal, during the summer, they have more manual labor and recreation. The parents cannot understand that the pupils are here to learn how to work as well as to read and write. We therefore cannot at present devote too much time to the former. Many students were injured while performing their chores, and the staff blamed them, accusing them of carelessness. Naturally, they never reported the injuries to the government. They only paid for the hospital bills after parents complained. While using a now antiquated laundry device called a mangle, one student's hand was crushed and it necessitated the amputation of all the fingers. The school expressed no sympathy and denied culpability. There were other amputations and even a fatality. The Department of Indian Affairs was determined to scrub indigenous languages from the minds of Aboriginal children. To quote Commissioner Edgar Dewdney in 1883, attention was to be given, quote, towards imparting a knowledge of the art of reading, writing, and speaking the English language, rather than that of Cree. In 1889, Deputy Minister of Indian Affairs Lawrence Van Coffnet and Bishop Paul Durieux declared that at the Cranbrook, British Columbia School, conversation at mealtimes was to be, quote, conducted exclusively in the English language. The principals were to also schedule fixed times when Aboriginal languages could be spoken. In 1890, one commissioner said, "At the most, the native language is only to be used as a vehicle of teaching and should be discontinued as such as soon as practicable." English was the only language of instruction, even in the Quebec schools. To quote one directive from 1893, "Every effort must be made to induce pupils to speak English and to teach them to understand it. Unless they do, the whole work of the teacher is likely to be wasted." Many principals bragged about the fact that most of their students spoke English fluently. If students still spoke native languages like Cree, it was seen as a failure of the student and of the school. It was considered to be endemic of poor discipline. In 1935, Oblate Superior General Theodore Laborde expressed his concerns about the fact that the suppression of Aboriginal languages was too draconian. As he put it, "The forbidding of children to speak Indian, even during recreation, was so strict in some of our schools that any lapse would be severely punished, to the point that children were led to consider it a serious offense. The children were often punished with brutality for speaking their native languages. The staff could get real creative in the punishments they meted out. As Mary Angus recalled, all the haircut to be as a man, that's what they do for us not to talk. We were afraid of that, to have our hair cut. That's what they got for, quote, speaking Indian, close quote." Some would whisper when they wanted to speak their Aboriginal language. Melvina McNabb was 7 years old when this rude awakening intruded into her life. As she put it, "I couldn't talk a word of English. I talked Cree, and I was abused for that, hit, and made to try to talk English. As Raymond Hill put it, I lost my language. They threatened us with a strapping if we spoke it, and within a year I lost all of it. They said they thought we were talking about them. They probably were. If they were sure the staff were out of earshot, they would speak the indigenous languages. Sam Kototnuk was overheard by a teacher speaking in Nukituk on his first day at the school. Sam recalled what happened next. "He took a ruler and grabbed my head like this and then smacked me in the mouth with the ruler 4 times. To quote Greg Rainville, who was punished for not carrying out instructions given to him in English, "The nuns would get frustrated with you when they talk to you in French or English, and you're not knowing what they're talking about, and you're pulled around by the ear." William Herney was caught speaking Mi'kmaq with his brother. He was strapped by a nun before she washed his mouth out with soap. Other alumni reported being made to eat soap when they spoke their native language. John Kistabish was forced to learn French at his Quebec school. It got to the point where he forgot his native language, which was Algonquin. When he was reunited with his family, he was unable to communicate with them, and therefore he could not relate to them the abuses he'd suffered. Aboriginal culture was also suppressed at the schools. Aboriginal culture was condemned, while non-Indigenous culture was cited as being superior, especially white Christians. Specific cultural practices were banned, like the sun dance, which is performed in summer. The students were warned that if it came to the attention of the staff of the school that they participated in the ceremony, they would be strapped. It was even referred to as, quote, devil worship, close quote, in some schools. One girl received a miniature totem pole as a gift from her family. When she showed it to a nun, the nun threw it in the garbage and condemned it as, quote, devilry, close quote. While some schools allowed native languages to be spoken, for the most part, those languages perished among the student body. To quote Rose Dorothy Charley, "They took my language. They took it right out of my mouth. I never spoke it again." Many of the students who went on to have children of their own taught them to speak English to make their lives easier. When many children were sent off to the residential schools, they were warned by their own parents not to speak Cree or any other native language. Part of the assimilation strategy involved Indian Affairs encouraging residential school students to marry each other. The government felt that if they married someone back at the reserve, all the schooling would go to waste. Marrying other students even became part of the process of graduation. In 1896, Deputy Minister of Indian Affairs Hayter Reed wrote, "It is considered advisable, where pupils are advanced in years and considered capable of providing for themselves, to bring about a matrimonial alliance, either at the time of being discharged from the school or as soon after as possible." The principals were charged with the task of marrying students off to other students. One principal reported with glee that another such couple had been married off. As he put it, "It is gratifying to note, again, that since my last report, 2 more couples of ex-pupils have been united in the bonds of holy wedlock. The ex-pupils who marry other ex-pupils are better able to retain the habits of civilized life which they acquired at the school." Efforts were also made by the government to block marriages they considered to be unsuitable. To quote Indian agent Magnus Begg in 1895 in his address to the Blackfoot Reserve, "No young man could marry a girl from an industrial or board school without having prepared a house with 2 rooms and owning cows with the necessary stabling, etc." In 1922, a proposal was made by the Presbyterian Church's Winnipeg Committee on Indian Work to the government to, quote, "make it unlawful for a pupil or ex-pupil of the school to marry or be married without the permission of the Indian agent." They also proposed that they be denied treaty annuities until the age of 21 and the right to attend school as a consequence of what they would have considered to be an unlawful marriage in this context. Fortunately, the legislation was never proposed or passed. Another challenge the children faced in the residential schools was being underfed. To quote Enos Montour, "The boys were always hungry. Grub was the beginning and end of all conversations." Eleanor Brass recalled that she was fed watery soup, devoid of flavor, with no meat. She remembered that one winter they ate fish nearly every day. In summer, the boys would trap gophers and squirrels and cook them over a fire to stave off the hunger pangs. Occasionally, they would share these rations with the girls. Mary John recalled being fed watery porridge interspersed with boiled barley and beans, accompanied by bread and lard. Sometimes weeks went by without any meat. Sugar and jam were only doled out on special occasions. Bernard Ketchaway said, "We had to eat all our food, even though we didn't like it. There was a lot of times there I seen other students that threw up and they were forced to eat their own vomit." There was some justice for this offense in 1999 when Anna Wesley, a former staff member, was convicted on 3 charges of administering a noxious substance. Meanwhile, the staff ate like royalty. The children's menu, bereft of nutrition as it was, put the children at risk of developing diseases. Many children died in the residential schools. Their complete numbers are unknown, as the Indian Affairs Ministry destroyed volumes of documents at that time. Their names were also excised from the official record. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada set up a national residential school student death register. This initiative represented the first official effort to document all the deaths of residential school students. The 3 sub-registers. 1. The Register of Confirmed Deaths of Named Residential School Students, the Named Register. 2. The Register of Confirmed Deaths of Unnamed Residential School Students, the Unnamed Register. And 3. The Register of Deaths that require further investigation to determine if they should be placed on either the named or unnamed register. In January 2015, a statistical analysis of the period between 1867 and 2000 revealed that 2,040 children died in the residential schools. The named and unnamed registers revealed 3,021 deaths. The health crisis was at its peak in the late 19th century and early 20th century. The high rate of death remained until the 1950s. Just less than 50% of the deaths occurred as a result of complications of tuberculosis. Those deaths declined with the introduction of medical treatment. Other factors that contributed to poor health in the Aboriginal population included withholding rations when they resisted switching from hunting to farming. The conditions on the reserves were not exactly conducive to a clean bill of health. The land was not as arable as a farm would require. The housing was inadequate and crowded. Sanitation systems were dysfunctional and access to clean water was limited. Under those circumstances, illnesses like measles, smallpox, and other infectious diseases proliferated. The residential schools were only barely equipped to handle such conditions either. Indian Affairs agreed only to arrange for emergency repairs. No provisions were put in place to ensure fire safety. And with over 50 schools burning down, many children died as a result. There were 170 other documented fires, many of which were started by students who were desperate to escape. As for the schools and government's mishandling of the health crisis goes, Simon Baker recalled when his brother, Jim, was dying of spinal meningitis. I used to hear him crying at night. I asked the principal to take him to the hospital. He didn't. After about 2 weeks, My brother was in so much pain. He was going out of his mind. I pleaded with the principal for days to take him to a doctor. One female student recalled what happened when her father found out her sister was ill. He came upstairs, and there we were. He cried over us. He took me home. He put her in a hospital, and she died. Aside from drugs that alleviated symptoms of tuberculosis, improvements in diet, housing, sanitation, and medical care improved the quality of life and health outcomes of the Aboriginal community. Children who died at the residential schools were not all afforded the same luxury as the nuns and priests who had headstones to mark their graves. The children who, in some cases, were placed in a grave with another child had graves that were marked only by a simple white cross. Requests by parents to have the child's body returned to the reserve were often denied, with the government stating that it was too expensive to do so. It became well known that the children in the residential schools were physically abused. Indian agent D.L. Klink returned a boy who had run away from the Red Deer Industrial School in 1895. There were bruises on the boy's head from when a teacher hit him with a stick. The school's principal, John Nelson, told Klink the teacher had been severe with him before, but he would be more severe now. Klink withdrew the boy from the school, knowing that such abuse would not be tolerated in a white school. He reported the abuse to Indian Affairs. Indian Affairs Minister Hayter Reed addressed the following to his staff. Instructions should be given, if not already sent, to the principals of the various schools that children are not to be whipped by anyone save the principal, and even when such a course is necessary, great discretion should be used, and they should not be struck on the head or punished so severely that bodily harm might ensue. The practice of corporal punishment is considered unnecessary as a general measure of discipline and should only be resorted to for very grave offenses and as a deterrent example. Indian Commissioner David Laird reported that several children had been too severely punished. To quote Laird, strappings on the bare back were too suggestive of the old system of flogging criminals. Many schools had a so-called, quote, punishment room, as Inspector J.G. Ramsden noted. I cannot say that I was favorably impressed with the sight of 2 prison cells in the boys' playhouse. I was informed, however, that those were for pupils who ran away from the institution, confinement being for a week at a time when pupils returned. In 1914, one father successfully sued a school for putting his daughter in a cell for 3 days with nothing but water to sustain her. Unsurprisingly, many children ran away and many were caught. One boy was shackled to his bed and beaten with a riding crop until he bled. Many boys who were beaten in this fashion nearly died of exposure in the winter while running away. The physical discipline was part of the culture shock for Isabel Whitford. As she recalled, all my dad have to do was raise his voice, and we knew what he meant. So when I first got hit by the nuns, it was really devastating because how can they hit me when my parents didn't hit me, you know? Geraldine Bobb recounted the tortures the staff would inflict on students. They would just start beating you and lose control and hurl you against the wall, throw you on the floor, kick you, punch you. Students who ran away and were returned to the school had their head shaven by a staff member, and it was done in front of other students. Another common form of physical discipline was pulling them by the ears, neck, or elbows. One former student said she became partially deaf after having her ear pulled. Boys who were caught having a snowball fight were struck on their hands with a hockey stick. Another winter-related punishment was when students who were not dressed for the weather were made to sit in snow for hours. 2 girls were punished for a misdeed by scrubbing a staircase for hours with toothbrushes while being closely supervised. Due to the trauma the students experienced on a regular basis, bedwetting was a frequent occurrence. The students who did so were made to stand in their urine-soaked clothes in a corner and were not allowed to change their clothes for a while. As Don Willie recalled, and they used to line up the wet bedwetters, and line them up in the morning and parade them through breakfast, the breakfast area, pretty much to shame them. Students were frequently locked in dormitories, broom closets, basements, and crawl spaces. Often they would be locked in a room with a mattress on the floor and fed a diet of bread and milk. There was always a risk that staff at the residential schools would sexually abuse these students, and that risk was known to Indian Affairs as early as the 19th century. In fact, in 1886, Jean Leroux was accused of sexually abusing the boys he oversaw. He was never prosecuted, but was allowed to resign. The churches and Indian Affairs covered up the sexual abuse of residential school children. When a principal was accused of sexual abuse, the only consequence he would face was a phone call from Indian Affairs. Some boys who ran away from a residential school in British Columbia were found by police, and the officers gleaned that sexual abuse was the motivating factor in driving the boys to flee. The boys were never returned to the school. The only penalty the offending party faced was to be transferred to a school in another province. Protecting the school's reputation was deemed more important than the well-being of the students. The sexual abuse continued into the late 20th century. Many staff members were not dismissed from their post after being convicted. Reports of abuse often went unreported to Indian Affairs, and Indian Affairs frequently failed to report such cases to the victims' families. It was only in 1968 when Indian Affairs issued a list of individuals who were not to be employed at the residential schools without approval by Indian Affairs. Such people were seldom prosecuted, however. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada has catalyzed the prosecution of over 40 residential school staff who were physically and/or sexually abusive to students. These legal actions were the result of the efforts of former students initiating litigation in adulthood. The entire scope of the abuse continues to trickle down into the public's awareness. By January 31st, 2015, the Independent Assessment Process, IAP, settled under the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement, received 37,951 claims for injuries due to physical and sexual abuse in the residential school system. By the end of 2014, the IAP resolved 30,939 of the claims. $2,690,000,000 was awarded to the plaintiffs. The Common Experience Payment, CEP, provided compensation to former students who attended a school on the approved list of schools compiled by the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement, IRSSA. The CEP addressed claims made by 78,748 former students. The sexual abuse proliferated for decades. For example, from 1958 to 1979, there was never a time in the history of Grolier Hall in Inuvik when the institution did not employ at least one dormitory supervisor who sexually abused students. Joseph Jean-Louis Como, Martin Houston, George Mazinski, and Paul LaRue were all convicted of this offense. William Peniston Starr was director of the Gordon's Saskatchewan School from 1968 to 1984. In 1993, he was convicted of 10 counts of sexual abuse. Arthur Plint was a boys' supervisor at the Alberni Residential School during 2 5-year periods between 1948 and 1968. In 1995, he pled guilty to 18 counts of indecent assault. Amid sentencing him, the judge described him as a, quote, sexual terrorist. Many former students who testified during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission hearings told of severe mental, physical, and sexual abuse. It was inflicted on both sexes with the same severity and frequency. New students were usually frightened and vulnerable, and a staff member would comfort them only to use the affection as a prelude to sexual impropriety. For instance, they would have them sit on their lap and then gyrate against them in a sexual manner. Josephine Sutherland spoke of being cornered by a member of the staff. I couldn't call for help. I couldn't. And he did awful things to me. It began in other ways. A student in a change room might suddenly find that a bag was pulled over their head. At other times, a student would be ordered to report to the showers in the middle of the night. That, or they might be told to have their lunch in a staff member's room or office where the sexual abuse would occur. Other students recalled being groped by staff as they walked the hallways or stairs. Students were also subjected to the humiliation of being watched by staff members as they showered. Students were frequently called to a supervisor's room at night. To guard against this, many students slept together. The older students would protect the younger students. Because the abuse occurred in isolation, most of these students thought they were the only ones going through it. Many were told by the abusive parties that they would face eternal damnation for reporting the mistreatment. Some students managed to fight back against their tormentors, and the staff would leave them alone. Many victims were told they wouldn't be believed if they reported the abuse. Many students begged their parents not to send them back while on break. Students who reported the abuse were often blamed for it. Tragically, many relatives were skeptical about their children's stories of abuse, contributing to the child's feeling of loneliness and pain. It was a betrayal that stung eternally. The abuse led to mental health complications. Not only did the children struggle to function in everyday life, but the younger and more vulnerable parties within the student body were bullied by older students. They were abused by both staff and students, and there was nobody to provide comfort and support. The bullies would force their victims to perform sexual acts. When sexual abuse was not on the menu, they would extort their treats, money, or other valuables. They would make them steal from other students. The staff modeled this behavior for the students, so it is hardly surprising that it was imitated. Cliques formed that were based on age, community of origin, and other demographic markers. It was a measure to increase safety and support. Percy Thompson recalled his experiences with one particular bully. One bully used to come at me, and he'd pretend he was going to talk to me, and all of a sudden hit me in the belly. And of course I gag. And he'd laugh his head off, and, to see me in such a predicament. As Albert Elias put it, the classroom was the safest place to be in, 'cause that's where nobody could beat me up. I dreaded recesses and lunches, and after school, I dreaded those times. Dennis Morrison recounted the hazing ritual new male students faced at the hands of older male students. They used to initiate you, like they would beat the hell out of you, the other kids would. It wasn't anybody else, it was the other kids, the older ones, eh? Bob Baxter recalled that there were student gangs, and that not only was he beaten up, but he was stabbed on one occasion and was once tied to a bed, whereupon scalding hot water was thrown on him. Clara Cuisas dealt with female gangs who were all armed with knives. As Louisa Birocht put it, we hated each other. So, this little gang didn't like the other gang. That's the way at the school. That's what we were taught. Fears. And we were scared. And I went to hide in what we called the junk room, the junk closet. Eventually, the specter of sexual abuse arose within the student-on-student abuse. From being forced to kiss someone, to simulating sex acts, to being raped, it was a free-for-all. Sometimes the victims were bribed into silence with treats, but at other times they were threatened with death in the event that they reported the abuse. Agnes Moses was sexually abused by the other girls in her school. To quote Agnes, "I never quite understood it, and it really wrecked my life. It wrecked my life as a mother, a wife, a woman, and sexuality was it was a dirty word for us." Don Willis was sexually abused by a group of boys. He said of that experience, "The only friends I kept after that were my relatives." The students' reasons for not reporting these incidents varied. Some worried that their bullies would retaliate. Some felt ashamed of what they went through. Others didn't understand what they were put through. And of course, there was fear of being disbelieved or blamed. The only thing that brought any joy into the lives of the residential school students' lives was sports. Though their own facilities fell short in terms of providing proper athletic venues, the boys' hockey teams they formed were successful. In fact, They won the Duck Lake Midget Championship team of 1949. Fred Sasakamoose went on to become the first status Indian to play in the National Hockey League. Prior to the Indian Act of 1920, parents could not refuse to send their children to the residential schools. With the advent of the Indian Act, many Aboriginal parents declined to send their children to these schools, with the result being that many of the schools closed due to under-enrollment. The schools were even more underfunded than before, creating an environment that was just as Dickensian as before. The parents were unhappy with the way the children were treated and provided for. In some cases, entire communities refused to send their children back to the local residential school. Eventually, organizations were founded to assert Indigenous rights. One such organization was founded in 1975, that being the World Council of Indigenous Peoples. This inspired the creation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The churches began issuing apologies to Aboriginal communities in the 1980s. Many former residential students came forward to share their stories of abuse, and many police investigations were launched. Amid these actions were lawsuits filed against the churches and the government. In 2008, Prime Minister Stephen Harper issued a formal apology to the victims of the residential schools. Among his remarks were, "These objectives were based on the assumption Aboriginal cultures and spiritual beliefs were inferior and unequal. Indeed, some sought, as it was infamously said, quote, to kill the Indian in the child," close quote. Today, we recognize that the policy of assimilation was wrong, has caused great harm, and has no place in our country. Stéphane Dion, the leader of the official opposition and the Liberal Party, said the government's policy on the residential schools, quote, had destroyed the fabric of family in First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities. Parents and children were made to feel worthless. Parents and grandparents were given no choice. Their children were stolen from them. The leader of the Bloc Québécois said to Canadians on behalf of the Aboriginal community to, quote, picture a small village, a small community. Now picture all of its children gone. No more children between 7 and 16 playing in the lanes or the woods, filling the hearts of their elders with their laughter and joy. Jack Layton, the leader of the New Democratic Party, urged Canadians to help, quote, reverse the horrific and shameful statistics afflicting Aboriginal populations. Now, the high rates of poverty, suicide, the poor or having no education, overcrowding, crumbling housing, and unsafe drinking water. Let us make sure that all survivors of the residential schools receive the recognition and compensation that is due to them. To this day, victims of the residential schools who remain struggle with mental health issues, addiction, and other health problems due to the trauma they experienced. Hopefully, they will enjoy a future that outshines their past. Thank you for listening to Human Monsters. Bye for now.